If you're in B2B SaaS and you want to know why too expensive is almost always a fake reason for churn, you should tune into this episode. We're going to go into understanding when the right time is to turn your customer success engine on so you're never left scrambling to keep customers, why sometimes you should actually pause feature launches until your whole team agrees on what activation even means. And what if I told you that there's one metric that you should obsess over before you go chasing that super sexy 130% net revenue retention number? Welcome to Retain or Die, the podcast where B2B SaaS teams learn why keeping customers isn't just part of the game, it is the entire game. No fluff, no buzzwords, just tactical, honest conversations with the people who live and breathe retention. Today's guest, Christian Meckelburg, ex-VC turned retention tactician and the mind behind Stackable's game-changing frameworks like the Churn Iceberg. He's helped startups save serious time, money, and energy getting laser-focused on keeping their customers. Here's what's coming up. We're going to talk about the Churn Iceberg, how to go beyond too expensive and uncover the real root causes of why customers are leaving, when to flip that retention switch, Christian's rule of thumb for building your customer success engine at the right time. Plus, we'll also go into defining things like activation versus adoption versus engagement, why you might need to hit pause on those feature releases. It's a drastic step until these definitions are locked in. And we're going to go over the one metric to rule them all, why starting with gross revenue retention deserves your full attention before netting out expansions and measuring NRR. If you care about stacking recurring revenue, listen up. Christian Meckelburg, thank you so much for joining me. This is Retain or Die. You are our first guest. I'm super excited to have you. You and I have had a bit of a conversation going on LinkedIn, and we've had a little catch up before this, but give us the 30-second intro. Who are you? What are you working on these days?
Wow, yeah, Peter, thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to be your first guest. Yeah, we have been talking a bit on LinkedIn. We're meeting in the retention CS bubble over there. So I've been active there for, I would say, a couple of months, starting my productized consulting services focused on B2B SaaS retention. So solving any kind of process problems, turning that audience. Yeah, it's been an exciting time so far, and built a lot of frameworks, a little bit of traction on LinkedIn already, and happy to chat about anything retention.
I'm a big fan of frameworks. I've noticed that you definitely are as well. And I really like what you've been building over there at Stackable. I think I got through the website, and I know you've got a lot on offer there, as well as consulting packages. You've got some frameworks that you're letting people have access to as well. If we wanted to maybe take a step back, you've had a bit of a varied career. This hasn't been all retention focused, churn focused, customer success world. You started in venture capital. Take us through that. Like, what's the experience been, and kind of how did you end up focusing on this with Stackable?
Sure. Maybe let me start with my personality. I think I've always been quite analytical. Maybe you can see that in the way I approach problems with frameworks. And I think I've always thought about like markets and business models and reflected, okay, what is the ideal state? What is the market equilibrium? Studied a bit of finance and kind of where's the puck going, and thought about that a lot. So I think for people like that, venture is a natural start because you make essentially financial bets on that. At the start of my career, I was luckily able to join a very analytical fund. As you know, the venture industry is quite hype-driven usually. So there was a counterpiece, I would say. So and there we basically, when I started really building out the B2B SaaS practice, built a lot of frameworks of how can we analyze these kind of repeatable machine-like businesses in the best possible way. To find, okay, what's a good investment, what's maybe not, which one's obvious that others jump on, and which is maybe not so obvious that we can analyze and create some, let's say, alpha layer, as financial people would call it. Yeah, we would share those frameworks quite openly with the founders we talk to, and even with the non-investments we would, for example, when the founder is too early and we maybe need one another or two, you would still have these very candid conversations on eye level where you really learn how we think, how the founder thinks, how we look at their business, and how we would act as a shareholder later on, being as predictable as possible, not as much driven as like the top line, which is the easiest thing to see, but kind of really trying to understand what is happening in the engine of the business to really understand what's going on. And after some time, we noticed some industry reputation building up, and these founders really talking about us, but also returning over time because of this, I would call, trust element. And essentially this funnel building, which is a bit different, I would say, than this pure brand, but really understanding the way of thinking that really left an impression on me. And not just the mechanic, which is good for fun, but also helping the ecosystem at the same time while you do it. So when I then became an operator on SaaS to essentially solve retention problems in the field, I built even more of these frameworks, and for example, the Churn Iceberg we'll maybe talk later on about. This came out of that, but rather soon this frustration for me settled in that I realized, okay, these frameworks are only going to be used by a single company, maybe collecting door, right? And I could see underutilized potential.
Yeah. How many businesses are born of that realization, right? Like, wait a minute. If I build it for just one company, that's it, right? So yeah, I love the story. Something I want to go back to that you mentioned there was you're looking for, you saw like obvious patterns and some non-obvious things. Is that kind of what you've built these frameworks off of? Maybe some of the non-obvious things that you were seeing back in the VC days when you were analyzing a lot of these companies?
I would say if I were coming with the VC mindset to what I'm doing now, I would kind of try to see what others are doing and do exactly the same thing. However, I think when I first, for example, built the Churn Iceberg framework, like a churn root cause framework, I don't think that's a groundbreaking thing. I think most top GTM orgs have something like that because you need that, right? Otherwise, you don't know who's churning and why. But I haven't seen anyone talk about it or do it. So I think just watching these kind of situations and just doing what you think is the right, sensible way, just being pragmatic. I think that's what we've been doing at the fund, and that mindset just stuck with me. So yeah, of course, I look at what others are doing, and I think the thing with artists, the great artist always gets inspiration, and there's always this remix happening. And that's also what I would love to see, that people take my stuff and maybe find out a way to break the framework, and so everybody learns a little bit. But I think this is the philosophy that stuck with me since early on.
I like that idea. If you're taking like the great artists steal sort of idea and you remix things, right? Like, so if your framework then gets taken by someone, and I think this is true from what I'm seeing around the success space in particular, when we talk about retention, a lot of people that we speak with, they're looking for, give me the playbook. I want to know what the signal is and then exactly what to do after that. And unfortunately, nuance slips in, and I've yet to meet a team that has the same exact problem that can be solved in the same exact way. So frameworks are nice, but they are not necessarily prescriptive, right? And so you do want people to kind of take that and remix it so that it's applicable to their exact situation. Otherwise, you're left running someone else's playbook, basically, right?
Yeah, I think it's always important to come with this approach, and especially in a very systematic business model like B2B SaaS. I believe that a lot of it is generalizable, and a lot of what the teams are doing in different companies is actually very similar, but they end up building different solutions to the same problem. So yes, I think you have to tailor to the business, and like this last mile you have to adjust. But if you say, okay, 80% is very similar because we're doing a very similar business model and try to achieve the same KPIs and outcomes, that you can kind of generalize. So I would say, let's try to build a framework that fits all of that. But of course, you have to adapt the last 20% to your business, and that's not always easy. But of course, if you already have something that you can build on, it's better than starting at zero.
With the companies that you're working with and what you're seeing now, where would you say a lot of them are? Are they at that 80%, or is that kind of what you're helping them get to? Is that 80% of a framework and then finishing that last 20% off? Do they come to you with an idea or already in place, or is this like starting from the ground up? They are just starting to think about these things.
I would say some of them are quite opinionated, and this is how it starts, and I think that's important. I would always love someone who's opinionated and tells me exactly how they want it, so we can kind of work on that, rather than, let's see what you're suggesting. So I absolutely love that. I think we have to take a step back to kind of understand why the retention and also the teams that drive it, customer success, are in the situation that they are today, and why someone like I exist, right? So I think I will start by saying, and also reflecting how your podcast is called Retain or Die. I think retention is really the lifeblood of SaaS. And if we step back in history and ask ourselves, like, how did everything start? I think it started with the default assumption of, okay, now there's a long-term customer relationship as opposed to this one-off thing, and they're gone and just paid us and we're out of it. And that in turn kind of created this, let's say, suddenly new valuable customer that you could work with that is very valuable, and you want to acquire it, and you can afford to pay a lot of money to acquire them. So it justifies a huge acquisition spend. You in turn increase budgets, AE commissions are soaring from, I think, originally 1 to 5% in transactional businesses to now 10 to 15% of ACV. You got training boom, you have frameworks like Spin and Medic, you got new roles, SDRs, BDRs, and now I think most recently RevOps and GTM engineers, of course, mostly again focused on acquisition. You have, I think, a term that we used at one of the companies where I was this sellers armed to the teeth with call intelligence and automated outreach, most recently with software categories being invented every couple of years. And the underlying belief really is we hope the customer retains, right? I mean, given all this investment, they have to, right? That's a very big ask of your retention teams. So business model only works when the customer retains. So if you look, however, what you have on the retention side, there's a big gap. So we have nothing comparable to the sales investment. We got few established industry practices with how to do success. And as a result, teams really invent their own stuff. And of course, then with variable quality, so often starting at 0, not at 80. And then it's a bit difficult to move from there. Oftentimes what I see then, and at least the reality that many teams, for them, the retention assumptions, they do not hold. And that is a big problem. And these startups often have the dilemma of, okay, either I straight up from after my seed round, I spend most of it on expensive leaders, for example, in CS, or I bet on juniors. And it's not an easy decision or an easy way out from that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I see that same sort of dilemma replaying itself from role to role, right? Like from marketing to product marketing. I keep hearing the same thing over all these companies. I think I'm of the same opinion that retention is the lifeblood. That's something that we actually talk about a lot internally, and we probably should be saying that more publicly, because if you don't have that solid foundation, what are you building on? I think you've got a unique perspective just where you're trying to come in and where you are working in the market. And it sounds like you're having more fun working with like the earlier stages. They're not staffed up with CS teams yet. So it's like these teams that you're working with are starting to get the sense that, yeah, retention is a big deal. How do we deal with this? Where do you think, or I guess maybe a question is, it's almost like, is there ever a time where it's too early to start thinking about retention? Or because this is something I've been thinking a lot about is, do you start thinking about retention from day one, or is it a 50 customer, 100 customer problem or when churn starts to get above a certain percentage and it's now eating into my revenue? Do you have any opinions on that? Like where I mean, we're talking frameworks, so maybe this isn't an exact science, an exact answer, but any way of thinking about when should I, as a business owner, start thinking about retention plays, for example?
I think there's two ways to approach it. One being this more product-led approach, one being this sales-led, CS-led approach. I think if you're product-led and from the beginning your acquisition is already the product and the retention is the product, then, and I think someone on LinkedIn recently also told me, hey, Christian, you're arguing from a very CS-led perspective. And yes, that's true, because that's what I do. Build the onboarding first, build the retention first, and that's the investment you should take in the very beginning. Or if you come to argue from a more sales-led perspective, and then I would say, even with my VC background, you should focus on sales in the beginning and make sure that you go from 0 to 1 and grow. And that's true for seed, maybe early Series A, that you just have to show that top line growth. Yeah, and you need to, at some point, make the switch, because, yeah, in the beginning, new business really drives your top line. But as you transition out of Series A, out of Series B in the direction of growth, your revenue comes more and more from retention. And those things you have to build up maybe a year before it becomes relevant, because this is really difficult work and you have to iterate a lot and build these processes. And it is people-based, it is not automated, and most markets just require this CSM counterpart, and you cannot build it and turn it live within a quarter. It doesn't become relevant super early, but you have to start building it early, otherwise you will be caught off guard.
So what I'm hearing is you don't need to do it from day one. However, it's not the kind of thing you don't flip the switch and you immediately have CS, customer success, working perfectly well. You need to ramp up on that. I know this is a hard question, but when would you advise a company to start thinking about this? How do you kind of pick that line where you say now is the time to start thinking about this, because in 6 to 12 months you're going to have this as a particular growth trajectory? Is there anything that you look for that comes to mind?
I would say as soon as you can repeatably acquire customers. And as soon as you have higher volume starting to trickle into your CS team, and the first, let's say, band-aid process fixes in place, where you kind of try to somehow push customers through, that can be already very dangerous, because these customers are supposed to stick with you for years. And if, let's say, early in the onboarding or somewhere in between something goes wrong, you damage these customers for a long time. And I'm not saying that you should hire an expensive leader very early, like a VP customer success after your seed round. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Hiring a junior and having kind of support CS all in one with one person, while having, I don't know, 5 sales on the other side, maybe also not. Again, this is the dilemma. But that's exactly the question that is important, and this is where I often come in and say, okay, here's some experienced help for someone who's done it before, built these processes and has seen different setups, coming in comparably low price, of course, compared to kind of CS leader at much lower execution risk. So there is actually this question and this gap in the market. I'm not the only one, of course, and this needs to be addressed. And so I suggest do it before you feel like you're putting too many band-aids into your process. Because the damage you do can last for a long time.
If you've gone through the entire roll of duct tape to stitch together whatever system that you're working through, it's probably time to like get on the phone and call someone and say, how do we actually systemize this in a way that's repeatable? Otherwise, I mean, I know I've been on teams. I feel like I'm firefighting now, like trying to keep track of Confluence pages, where it's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure we have a process for that. It's on some page buried in some other folder somewhere that I'll spend an hour finding it. I wrote it too, and I can't find it. Like that kind of hot mess that you get yourself into. Speaking from experience, anyway, I'm sure I can't be the only one that does that. But so for you coming into a team, so you're saying, I'm really digging into this because I think this is where over the last year, I've had a lot of conversations with teams from, being one and two co-founders working on things. They're getting traction, not at all thinking about any sort of retention stuff. It's just, I got to get out and sell. One of us is selling, one of us is building, and that's all we're doing. And then up to teams of 50, 60, 100 plus that are just now starting to think about it, and they're 10 years into their journey. So I think it's that question of once you make that decision, this is something that we need to pay attention to. Is this a good time to maybe pivot to that iceberg, your framework? How do you start thinking about this, right? So if you come into a company today and say the founders are now starting to get worried, churn is climbing, they don't really know why, they're asking that question, do we bring in a CS leader, a chief customer officer? How hard do we lean in on this? What's your approach to that? And because I think a lot of companies are kind of at that point that we're speaking with anyway, that are retention aware, and that's about it. It's I know this is a problem or something that I need to think about, but I don't know where to start.
Yeah. Well, I would say when you see the problem, you have it, right? There's not a lot of fluff going on. It's when you have a sales problem, you're not acquiring customers. When you have a retention problem, you're not keeping the customers or not making out of them what you should be making, and you go all excited into the deal, and then that excitement fades on both sides. So it's clearly observable. So what I typically do in the very beginning of any client that I work with is an audit stage where you try to understand together what is the real problem, where's churn coming from, and what are the underlying processes that are not working. There's a limited set of processes, of course, in a given retention journey, and you could zoom into everyone and see, okay, what are you doing at the moment? Why do you do it? And why is it maybe not resulting in the outcome that you want? And of course, in the beginning, to understand past historical churn, something like the Churn Iceberg framework, and I'm happy to also now take the time and go into it, can be helpful to really understand and oftentimes do it really for the first time.
Let's walk through that, because I think that, I've had a look at it, and I think that would be super helpful just to hear you talk through it. Just guide us through what does that look like, because I think that's where a lot of companies are right now, is trying to figure out what this really means.
Quick warning, I think I could talk an entire podcast about that. I think I could fill 2, maybe. So maybe that you would want to listen. I will try to make it, let's say, a little bit shorter, skip a few things, I guess. Hope not to lose anyone.
Whatever you think is valuable, by all means, go for it. I think people will tune in because, again, it's a problem. And if you don't know where to start with this to me is a big opportunity for all of us, really, to learn.
Yeah. In any case, I would suggest afterwards or maybe during spin up LinkedIn, go to my profile, you'll find the whole framework there. There's no lead form, no spam, just access it. Feel free to steal it, understand it. I think this is something that most top orgs should have, and maybe some of you have it. But yeah, I guess let me start right in. I think in general, what is the Churn Iceberg? It's a churn root cause framework. So it really helps you understand why do customers churn, so you can learn from it and prevent it at the same time. So the analogy from the iceberg kind of comes from this, okay, customer tells you why they churned, or you kind of first hear that someone churned. This is the top symptom on above the surface. But then as you move below the surface, this is where all the root causes and the structure of the root causes on different levels kind of come out, and they're hidden. So you have to do something to really understand them. And why do you need such a framework? Isn't it obvious? Let me give you maybe an example, the most classic one. Imagine someone churns, a customer churns, and they say, the price is too high. That's the problem. It's too expensive. And already there, this question comes in, okay, well, is it a budget topic or is it a value topic? Don't you have the money? And the value is okay, we're doing good, but you cannot pay? Or do you have the budget, you would pay for something like that, but we're not delivering? And this is, I think, where the essence of the whole thing already comes in. And it doesn't really tell you anything actionable. It could be anyone responsible to solve it. Who do you want to give it to? I would even argue that all churn ultimately relates to pricing. If pricing was not an issue, customers would keep paying, right? So in a more deep philosophical sense. But essentially that is just the tip of the iceberg. You have a budget value mismatch, and you can go deeper from there. So is it a lack of budget? Is it a lack of value? So let's assume that we're not delivering enough value. Is it because they're not using the product enough? So is it an adoption problem? Or are they using it incorrectly? Or doesn't that feed their needs at all? So is it a lack of working use cases? Maybe they're not a fit. Maybe they didn't get guidance. So as you can see, you can go quite deep on that and ask these questions. And ultimately, you want to arrive at churn reasons on the lowest level that are so-called MECE. That's a fancy consulting term, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. It's just a term for all possible options covered, no overlaps. And you want to have full accountability for just one team that in the end, let's say it's a lack of features, well, that's a product topic, or lack of it, that's sales, or lack of guidance is CS in that case. So because we all know that shared responsibility typically causes inaction. You arrive at those eight root causes, and ultimately you have stuff like, again, lack of fit, lack of features, lack of buy-in. So that, for example, being one that is really customer internal. So does the organization really collectively decide we are going to use that tool and tell the users, okay, you have to use that. That is our project. And we can influence that, of course, by enabling the champion. You can already, I think, maybe hear that a lot of those churn reasons are framed as a lack of, like a deficiency from the GTM team. And that's intended because it assumes that you have to solve the problem for the customer, and essentially the customer is never wrong. Yeah, so that creates an internal accountability. There's a couple more assumptions, but that's essentially on a high level what the framework is about.
Yeah. And so you've found those, right? So you're working your way down to the root cause. You've got your mutually exclusive, you got your MECE, right? And which I'm having flashbacks to Deloitte days here. I haven't heard that in a long time, but yeah, I was sitting at a very big conference table, I think the last time I heard that. So that's my PTSD from consulting days. But now you've gone down, you've done the root cause analysis, you've figured out what this problem really is. And not only that, but not for one customer, but for many. And you've said that the framework is to find the root cause and then also to sort of drive action. What are you doing with that? We've found the root cause. That then goes to a particular team to fix that. So it kind of depends. This is where it gets into that. It depends now, right? Like, who is it? Is it feature? Is it pricing? Is it onboarding? Is it activation? And who owns that? One thing that you said there that I think is really interesting, and that I know I overlooked for a lot of years, is when I buy a tool, I'm buying it for a reason. And if I don't then either adopt it myself or get my team to adopt it, that's kind of my fault as well. So it's not necessarily always on you as the vendor to say, provide a great product. What am I running into internally at a bigger company, for example, to say, like, I'm just not getting adoption. I thought I had buy-in. I thought I had executive sponsorship to roll this thing out. I don't. So, like, it's maybe out of your hands as a vendor sometimes, but even then, I think you've got to understand, is that the root cause? Are we running into that over and over again? Adoption is a big thing. How do we fix that? And then I don't know where that goes, this is company by company. Is that with product? Is that with CS? Is that the handover from sales to success? It's kind of hard to know how to just sort of theoretically pop those out. But is that kind of the thinking that you're talking about? Like, we've done the root cause now. Who owns it?
Well, maybe going to your point that you mentioned, is sometimes it's out of the vendor's hand. And I think that's an easy way out. If that's really the case, how much, like, where's the point where you can do everything in terms of enablement you could ever do, but that market, that customer group, or that product type has an adoption problem. I think, for example, knowledge bases like those intranets in companies, if you have a product for that, I've seen that from a VC perspective quite a few times, where you just know in the industry that these internal Wikipedias, like, people don't really go there a lot. I think that's more like a product category topic, and I think now as we've transitioned to AI being able to read that, kind of bring it with questioning over to the user, maybe that's something that you want to introduce. Maybe that's a missing feature, right? Or you want to create workshops to make sure that users know about it, know how to use it, or create buy-in, that the leader says, hey, please document these processes and use them regularly. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can tackle these problems from your side. And I think, of course, there's some residual topics. Maybe 10 years ago, you could have said it's just a product category of intranets that is difficult and adoption is just low, or you find ways to tackle that. But where do you stop, right? If you stop too early, then it's an excuse. So you want to be mindful of that. And I would always say, just try to keep the problems inside and try to solve as much as possible, rather than just giving up and saying, hey, that's a product category, or hey, that's a difficult customer.
I think it's a really good point. Yes. So I'm eating my own words now, saying that it's out of our control, because of course it's not, right? So that is on you as the builder and seller of the product to focus on adoption. And I think that's one of the things that I know I keep having conversations about, is in particular with startups recently, where they're getting traction, or so it seems, right? Where we're getting signups And maybe that's on the back of strong founders, founder relationships, and you're getting strong signups, but that adoption and that stickiness just isn't necessarily coming. And one thing, I'm going to use this to segue over to something that I think we traded notes on LinkedIn about this, is defining your terms, right, across teams. And I think it was activation was the one that you made a pretty strong point. I'm paraphrasing here, but it was basically like, if you don't agree on these terms, in particular activation in this case, you should pause all product releases until everybody agrees on what this means. Like, what are we measuring and why is it important? Can you talk me through that? Like, why is it important for teams to have a unified understanding of like, what are the targets that we're aiming at? Let's use activation as that example. Why is that so important to get teams on the same page there?
Yeah, sure. I would say starting from the core principle of having culture of accountability, let's take the analogy of sales. If a new customer churns immediately, and that happens repeatedly, like basically your entire new pipeline churns away next month, to be very extreme in that example, you would tell sales to stop acquiring until this is fixed, right? Because you're wasting money and it's not helping you a lot, right? So the same, I would say, if you look at features and the activation of, say, features or use cases being the more broader term for that, you only build features you expect to be used, right? So if you don't know if current features are being used, how can you be sure that anything you're building right now, your team has spent months developing, is actually being used when it's released? So I think there's multiple responses to that, how you can figure that out. But yeah, one response can be as drastic as pausing development until it's clear. And now coming back to the statement, I think in Germany you would say plakativ. So it's like a simplistic, attention-grabbing, poster-worthy, that's where it comes from, statement. It doesn't grasp every nuance of the issue. Of course, the topic isn't black and white. If you are, for example, early stage, you have strong conviction on feature, by any means, go build it. Maybe your current customers are not even a fit, right? You switch your ICP, so you cannot look at the data, or you don't have enough data. It's really not black and white. I think the main goal, and also why I made the statement, is to raise attention on the topic and start a conversation. Because whether you disagree or agree with the topic, whether you should pause feature development or not, I think we can all agree that the conversation about activation is an important one.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely feel that way. It's interesting to me how many definitions are out there. We recently went to a customer success conference, and one speaker in particular was sort of pulled up by the audience saying, all right, you referred to the same thing with 4 different words. How am I supposed to internalize this? If you called it activation, you also used adoption the same way. Onboarding is not activation necessarily. So how do you define this? And I think that's one of the things that I've found most frustrating about the customer success space is there is not a common definition of what that means. And I think that's true across disciplines, right? That's not just a CS thing, but by and large, you take activation metrics from one company to the next, and the understanding of it is completely different. And some people dismiss it outright, some don't care. Others, it's like the thing that we're paying attention to, but how they define that just seems to change from team to team. And I don't think there's any way to fix that necessarily.
I'm not sure. I think it's coming a little bit from the PLG world, where everything is kind of happening at the same time to the user, and we're all using these tools while we have a business that is people process led. So I think if you have kind of blurry definitions and get influenced by these fancy topics in the, they say, PLG movement that popped up, I guess, 10, 15 years ago, that can happen. I think if you were asking me how to define those things happening separately, which is more closely to how it actually happens in the CS-led world, I would say onboarding is this event where you bring business users for the first time really to the product, oftentimes in a session together with a champion and you as the counterpart, and you kind of tell everybody, hey, what is this new tool that was acquired? Why is it going to be used? How is it solving the challenges that are being faced? And how is it creating value? And how do we actually do it? And this is not actually meant really to activate, not yet, but more like anchoring the product in the organizational processes. So everybody knows, hey, this is a new tool we are going to use, and there's the organizational buy-in that you want to create. And then, of course, when they come into the tool, then this is exactly where activation starts. I would define it as, I don't have a perfect definition right now, but I would say this is a sequence of actions that you execute in the product as part of a use case, and that causes you to really learn how to create value. And that at the same time, the sequence of steps creates an aha moment that also creates a retention baseline. I think I have it written down somewhere, so maybe refer to that. And engagement, and I think adoption is kind of this thing in between activation engagement. Kind of adoption sounds to me like kind of repeatedly using it, but it doesn't. It's a focus on kind of this initial learning how I feel. So engagement, I would say, is the step after activation, where it's like riding a bike. You learned how to ride a bike initially, and it's sometimes a little bit difficult, but then the bike is standing maybe in your basement somewhere outside, and you still have to go to work. So you really have to ride the bike to work repeatedly to gain this value, right? One enough. So after you've learned how to ride a bike, you then want to encourage this routine habit of gaining value repeatedly. And I think these are two different things that happen, and you have to steer touch points and interactions in that regard as well.
I like the analogy. I tend to think about adoption as it's almost like it's become part of a workflow where it is now a part of what we do on a regular basis. So the bicycle there is like, this is how I get to work, right? This is the way. And it's weird if I do it a different way. If a friend picks me up or if I get on the train, that's a different thing. But most of the time I'm going to ride my bike to work. I kind of envision adoption that way. And I do agree. And something that Kate, one of my partners at a Coil, talks about activation as like running a hurdles, 100-meter hurdles, right? Where you've just got to cross these hurdles to get to that aha moment. So that's how we're kind of visualizing that. I think that's one way that we're playing around with visualizing what activation means in the sort of bigger scheme of things. While we're talking about these numbers, which is basically these are metrics, right? So activation metrics, adoption metrics, you can measure that, engagement, you can measure. You've called your business Stackable. It's obviously about like stacking revenue. What does that look like in terms of the metrics and dashboards? What are you looking to measure? Is it activation? On the back of doing your churn analysis, what are you looking at to indicate like we're doing well now? We now have a healthy business where I'm not sort of saying ignore sales, but right now we're focused on this retention side. What are you looking to measure? And what's your suggestion to teams? Where do you start to understand how healthy our business is?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The core idea is the fundamental recurring revenue in the SaaS business. I think the term was coined originally by Winning by Design maybe, but I'm not exactly sure. I think I picked it up at some point during my investor days. The concept really being you acquire a customer some revenue once, let's say month 1, and then in month 2 you don't start at 0. You start at that revenue, and the new build essentially stacks on top of that, and it really comes from this visual analogy or representation of, and I used to draw this picture like a lot, revenue cohorts on a stack chart. Say for example, if you output your billing data and put it into Microsoft Excel, and then you can draw this cohort group, customers by month or quarter, and then you can see this visual representation, and this is essentially stackable revenue. And the crucial metric, I would say, it's really gross revenue retention, so GRR, meaning what % of existing revenue did you actually retain. And this is the first step before you actually think about expansion, net revenue retention. This is really the fundamental. You actually, when you think about how do I build up my SaaS function, this is also the metric that you start tracking in the very beginning. That's essentially it. So you want to hope that the revenue sticks for a long time and you want to minimize churn.
So GRR over NRR when you're first getting started. I tend to agree with you. I think NRR is kind of like I think it's sexy because it's over 100%, right? Like you can get, if you've got a number that's 130%, of course that looks great. But GRR, you're going to max out at 100. So there's a ceiling on that. But that's what you're saying is that's where teams should start paying attention to, because that's really like the core of the business.
Absolutely. And if you manage to reach 100%, and that's repeatedly, that's not just a coincidence for that cohort, it's a great sign that you're done. And I think you don't get that often. Of course, to reach 100, I would aim for 90, 95. And there's benchmarks depending on your customer segments. Are you SMB, are you enterprise? SMB, of course, being a little bit lower, maybe closer to 80. Enterprise being closer to 90 and above. And when you reach those benchmarks, it means they could proceed further. So your customers are engaged, they're creating repeated value on a regular basis so that they stay with you as a result. And if you're done with that, you got a perfect signal for you and your team. Okay, we're done, let's move forward and work on expansion. But many teams, of course, see the shiny 130% NR figure on the benchmarks of Bessemer Iconic, and I used to send that to my founders back in the day, and well, I didn't know better, but now as an operator with those insights, I know you have to start with GRR, and then over time, when you tick that box, of course you always have organic NRR a little bit, we have seed-based expansion, but typically you don't have a product range that allows for upselling, maybe more seats, but maybe not cross-selling, so NRR maybe isn't in the cards anyways, so keep focusing on GRR, tick that box, and then move forward, and not before.
I like that. I'm keeping on here for a while, but so that actually makes me, I've got one more question on that, in that line of thinking here. So another thing that comes up a lot is segmentation of customers. And you're saying, what I heard was, if you're measuring gross revenue retention per cohort, would it also be helpful for companies to do that by customer segments, right? So to look at, like to start understanding, and this is kind of like ICP definition almost, but how do you understand where are we getting the most traction? So measuring GRR on a customer segment basis, is that something that would be helpful for teams to do?
I would maybe take a step back and kind of look at the 3 different ways we can look at GRR. And I think cohort is kind of in the middle. And then kind of segmenting is kind of the last step where you really drill down to the number. I think there's another option which you could use, and it's periodic, right? You can just have your top line and your revenue movements and look at all customers together, right? You see revenue month 1, you can see the churn from all those customers in one bucket. And that's typical because of that blend of the old and new customers to kind of see what are the movements, like what am I doing differently from 6 months ago in acquiring and retaining the customers versus maybe the last month. So cohort analysis is definitely the next step to get further the truth. And then segmenting is of course next level. I would say you can already see ICP segments if you refocus by time. So if you start, now it's July, is the last customer that is non-ICP was just acquired. Okay, now we shifted our sales funnel, our pipeline is now clean. We only have now our ICP. You can kind of see, okay, starting August, that might already be a good segmentation. But for example, and I see that every now and then, that companies kind of start with a PLG approach. So I have a lot of low touch, low ticket volume with a little bit higher churn because they don't really know how to touch base with those because it's quite expensive relative to the ARPA. And then you start kind of a sales-led motion with customers that have higher tickets, need more touch points, and that's worth it, of course. But you have those customers kind of at the same time because you don't want to switch off the lucrative self-serve PLG channel that kind of runs and churns, but you kind of make some revenue. So in that sense, I think it makes sense to segment further if you're only core view. But yeah, I think you already got a good grasp for the overall trend.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you for indulging me on that one. I think that's a really good point of starting with the periodic, because I know I tend to go, I want to go all the way down to segments like immediately. So maybe I need to sort of pull myself back a little bit sometimes, but I've kept you for a while. If anybody wants to reach out to you, understand more about the frameworks that you have, where should they go and find you? What's the best channel to get at you?
That will be on LinkedIn. I think that's the best place. Just search for my name plus Stackable. I try to be as active as possible there. So DMs are open. I love to chat about all things retention, frameworks, processes, challenges. So just feel free to connect and send me a message.
I've got a final question for you. If anything's come to mind that you would want to ask somebody else in this like retention world, if there's any questions that you have, and you can even ask me a question, I suppose, like why not? But if there's anything that came to mind during that call that you would want to ask, or maybe even if it was like a question that you would ask a potential client, like what are you looking at, that sort of stuff. Are there any questions that you would ask a future guest of Retain or Die?
I think it's quite a general question, but I think it tells a lot about the philosophy of the future guests and their experience, because I think in many ways the way you respond is very based on your experience and where you come from. So I guess you can learn a lot. And the question would be, what prevents most retention teams from achieving good retention? And I think there could be a broad range of answers, right? I would say processes. I think processes and frameworks that come in and tell everybody what to do and how to work together. If you ask me, this would be my answer. But I think that there's many answers. And if you ask, for example, a CS leader, maybe they would answer with, let's say, leadership, interpersonal topics, right? Maybe underlying the ongoing friction, conflict between teams, CS acquiring bad for customers, CS complaining, and those dynamics really not leading to a functional relationship between the teams, right? So I think that really tells you where people are coming from and what they think is the solution. And there's many ways in the end to solve this and different approaches. So I think that could be interesting.
I like that one. It's an open door. You can walk through it and say whatever you want. I feel like someone might be very cautious in how they answer that one, but I think it would be telling. As I reflect on that myself, I think it is, what do I think? What's my opinion on this? Not necessarily fact-based, but it'd be interesting to ask. So if you're comfortable with me asking the next guest, I will pose that to whoever that ends up being that we're recording with next.
I'll be listening.
I'm excited to have you listening. I'm excited to have you on. Thank you so much for recording this. I can't say thank you enough. And thanks for sharing everything that you did. If you've tuned into this, you got value, and you want to ask Christian any more questions, you heard where to reach him, head over to LinkedIn, connect with him there. I'm following him. He's sharing a lot of really good stuff. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, Peter. It was a pleasure. It's really fun.
That was gold. A huge thank you to Christian for breaking down how to dig past surface churn excuses like pricing, how to nail the timing on when you set up your CS engine, and how to get everyone on the same page regarding activation, adoption, and engagement, and what you're really measuring. And yes, if you're not tracking gross revenue retention before you chase expansion and NRR, you're missing the foundation of a really healthy B2B SaaS business. If you got value from this episode, please do us a favor, hit subscribe so you never miss a teardown of another retention playbook and conversations like these. Leave a review wherever you listen, please. It helps other SaaS teams find the show. And of course, head on over to LinkedIn to connect with Christian. He's dropping frameworks over there all the time. I love his stuff. I'm Peter Preston, and you've been listening to Retain or Die from A Coil.